So now everything in the game that isn't infantry can move and fire with heavy weapons for absolutely no penalty. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where over the last few weeks we've been covering all of the new changes that Games Workshop has made for 9th edition 40k. I'll be honest, this was a change I completely didn't see coming. Last night when Games Workshop talked about the tanks being able to fire into close combat, they actually went back and edited their article slightly after to include another new previewed rule. I'd say that this has similar magnitude and impact on the game compared with the tanks and close combat thing. The heavy weapons rule has taken a very drastic change, so we're going to take a look at it in detail, talk about a bunch of the things in the game that are going to be more viable than before, talk about some rules that it might make a bit redundant, and discuss whether or not it was a good change. So here is the new heavy weapon rule then. Basically the rule goes as this: when an infantry model shoots a heavy weapon, subtract 1 from the hit roll when resolving that weapon's attacks if the firing model's unit has moved for any reason that turn. So there's one huge change to the rule and one minor change to it. Of course, the biggest change is that virtually all unit types in the game that aren't infantry now will be able to move and blaze away happily with their heavy weapons, not taking any penalty when they're moving and shooting them. Naturally, the most obvious beneficiary of this are going to be things like tanks, things like predator tanks, or vindicators, who will now not have to choose between moving and firing at full effect. It's also going to apply to monsters, such as various Tyranid monstrous creatures, cavalry, should they be able to bear any heavy weapons in your codex, bikes, particularly things like Space Marine attack bikes, Tau battlesuits such as riptides and broadsides, and also Tau drones as well. All of these guys are just going to be a lot more mobile while putting out their maximum damage output. We'll run through each of those classes briefly in a second, but the second and also slightly more subtle change to the rule is that now even for infantry they've actually copped another nerf with this rule. Basically previously in the other rule, if the model had moved itself then it would be suffering a -1 to hit penalty, but say if you had a big mixed Space Marine squad, say with 1 las cannon and 10 regular guys with bolters, all of the other regular guys with bolters could mill around and do whatever they wanted, moving and firing and maybe daisy chaining back to the heavy weapon who's staying stationary. I'm afraid it looks like that's no longer able to be done now. Even if the individual model with the las cannon stays still, if any of the other models in the unit move, then it is now going to be suffering the -1 to hit penalty, so it's basically move the entire squad or move no one are your decisions for heavy weapons. This one's very much going back a couple of editions in the game now. I believe it used to always work this way, except instead of a -1 to hit penalty, it was just not being able to shoot the heavy weapon whatsoever. I think they changed it in something like 6th or 7th. So obviously points are all going to be rebalanced, and it means that any given vehicle might not be any better than it was before, but in general to the class, this is a massive boon for vehicles throughout an army. Your traditional firepower gunline tanks, such as predator tanks, or dreadnoughts packing a whole load of heavy weapons, will now be really quite mobile compared to before, able to zip around the battlefield each turn to try and get those heavy weapons in range, and it's going to make getting a line of sight a bit easier. It'll also be good for any advancing transports and things, say razorbacks with twin las cannons that ideally want to be trundling forward to deliver their cargo, but also want to be firing at the enemy. I quite like the change for fast attack units such as Guard Sentinels, Admech Iron Striders, or Space Marine Landspeeders. All of these guys have really good movement, and basically you're not really getting much value out of the unit unless you're making use of it, but whenever you make use of it, you are always suffering that -1 to hit modifier. It basically made all of these units really quite struggle, seeing as you're paying for both movement and firepower, and under normal circumstances you couldn't have both of them efficiently. It's also pretty good for hybrid walker type things, such as Space Marine Dreadnoughts. Redemptor Dreadnoughts will be far happier stomping forward and blazing away at Ballistic Skill 3 with that Heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon or Macro Plasma Incinerator, and again you won't be stuck with an awkward choice as to whether or not to get the movement to get closer to the enemy or to fire at them with full effect. Flyers without anything like Power of the Machine Spirit will absolutely love this as well. In particular the Storm Raven's jealous cousin, the Corvus Blackstar for the Death Watch. That thing will absolutely love being able to move and fire without penalty, as will Imperial Guard vehicles such as the Valkyrie or the Space Marine Stormhawk Interceptor, which became very strong when it could access this rule via the Iron Hands Doctrine. All of these flyers just got far more dangerous in terms of damage output, though of course I wouldn't be surprised if points cost went up proportionally. In particular though, I think this is almost guaranteed to be a very solid buff for any Ballistic Skill 4 armies. They just get caught by the moving and shooting heavy weapons penalty far more than the Space Marines do, as dropping from a 4 to a 5 is a far bigger percentage decrease compared with dropping Ballistic Skill 3 to Ballistic Skill 4 for example. Imperial Guard Sentinels, Chimeras and Lehman Russ battle tanks will absolutely love this, as will things like Genestealer Cult Ridge Runners or Goliath Rock Grinders, or plenty of the Chaos Demon engines. I think these vehicles have really been a victim of this rule, as they suffer from moving and firing their vehicles far more than Space Marines do, for example. In terms of other units affected, there are some slightly weird ones in here. Artillery might be in a very strange place, weirdly able to move their Thunderfire cannons or Orc Smasher guns by like 3 inches per turn without penalty, and things like Guard Artillery with Basilisks and things will be able to zoom around at an absolutely breakneck 12 inches per movement phase, still somehow being able to load and fire their Earthshaker cannons at full effectiveness. In all fairness, they can already do that as Talon, but it's not exactly the most optimal regiment to take on them as it doesn't add damage output. For artillery, I'd be quite happy if Games Workshop did manage to find some sort of bespoke solution to this, as it just doesn't really seem to make too much sense from a visualising the game point of view. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Any monsters that are bearing heavy weapons will have no penalty to moving and shooting. I did write Tyranids on this slide, but I will admit I'm not even certain if they even have any heavy weapons on their monstrous creatures. The only ones that I could find were able to move and shoot anyway. I guess the Exocrine can technically, but in general you're going to be wanting to keep that one still anyway. I think Tau could potentially win from this quite big. Riptides flying around without the need for a target lock means that they could be taking other things like velocity trackers. And again, on the weird moving artillery thing, broadside stomping around for no penalty, moving and shooting 5 inches a turn. Looks like it could most certainly be a thing, unless Games Workshop writes anything into their datasheet preventing them from moving and firing at full effect. Tau marker drones could also be a decent benefit as well. Being able to fly around on a durable platform at long range each turn could perhaps make people give them a second look, rather than just going for the tried and tested Pathfinders. And finally, other fast moving bikes and things with heavy weapons, such as attack bikes from Space Marines, or Genestealer Occult Jackal bikers bearing heavy stubbers and things, again will be able to move and fire at full effect, so much like the fast moving vehicles, you're not going to have to make that awkward choice between either moving or shooting straight. One thing that's quite interesting from this change is just how many rules redundancies it creates. I think partly because of the slightly strange scenarios that some of these units would be in. If you completely disincentivize them to move, there are currently quite a lot of rules in the game that allow you to move and shoot with vehicles, for no penalty to move and shoot with heavy weapons. We already mentioned Talon. Basically this rule completely makes their vehicle part of their regiment trait entirely useless, as essentially every single guard regiment is getting Talon baked in for free. Though of course when I say free, probably at a bit of a points bump on their unit prices. We already mentioned Tau target locks as well for Riptides. The first turn Iron Hands doctrine on anything that isn't infantry. Now it only gives reroll 1s, not moving and shooting, because you already get that. The very recently released Admech Mars Canticle, the one that gives you +1 strength to your heavy weapons and also move and shoot them all for free, now I believe only applies to Skitarii Rangers with transuranic arquebuses, and an absolute ton of datasheets have rules on them saying you can move and shoot with heavy weapons for no penalty with this model, such as this Admech Onager Dunecrawler, Space Marine Land Raiders with Power of the Machine Spirit, or Tyranid Tyrannifexes, just to name a few of them. I'm sure pretty much every army has abilities similar. One interesting one that could be potential winners out of this whole situation are things like flyers that get around the -1 to hit penalty by getting +1 to their hit rolls. Basically Space Marine Storm Talon gunships could move and shoot at ground targets on 3s as they got a +1 to hit against ground. They'll now be zooming around hitting ground targets on 2s at all times, unless they decide to go back and rewrite their datasheet or something. I do find it interesting as to whether or not Games Workshop will allow these guys just to languish with the rules that they have, or whether they will do mass erratas and FAQs to clear up all these redundancies. For example, if I did collect Talon Guard, I'd be just a little bit disappointed if the other regiments all basically got the same regimental bonus as you for free, and you got nothing extra. I have absolutely no doubt that Games Workshop will fix these as they go through releasing codexes for 9th edition, much in the same way that they released updated codexes for 8th. But depending on exactly where your codex crops up in their release cycle, you really could be waiting quite a long time. I do suspect one way or the other that the older codexes will be seeing quite a lot of FAQs at the start of 9th. So I'd be very interested to hear as to whether or not you think this is overall a good change or a bad change. In theory it shouldn't necessarily be a massive buff to vehicles, as I'd hope that Games Workshop would adjust the points values to better reflect their new abilities. In general, at least on a per model basis, it means that guns will be more mobile, meaning that in general you get a higher damage output over the course of a game. Basically sometimes tanks do need to move to be able to get better lines of sight on things, and that means that every time that situation crops up, you'll be getting more damage out of the tank, or even sometimes you might just want to move, so you'll be able to get in range of a more optimal target. Again, that could likely mean that you're dealing better damage earlier in the game. With that new smaller recommended game size, I could imagine that quite a lot of heavy weapons being brought to bear early in the game could make quite a big difference, although I guess we'll have to see if they've done anything fancy with the terrain rules, meaning that lines of sight might not be quite as easy to get as previously. On the other hand, I really do quite like the change for things like attack bikes, land speeders and sentinels, things that want to be moving, and this way they get the best of both worlds rather than being messed up whichever way they go. And I do really like the way that it's not going to impact ballistic skill 4+ armies disproportionately now, at least not on tanks anyway. I think the biggest loss for the game might be actually on the backfield gunnery units, exactly things like this Predator tank or maybe Lehman Russ battle tanks for their sponsons and things, as you are kind of removing a tactical decision from the game. It makes exact positioning a little bit less key. You could have deployed them in a really stupid place, but if you can move them 10 inches before you shoot, then you're likely going to be able to get in the optimal place anyway. You also don't have the decision between either getting absolutely optimal positioning or getting maximal firepower, you just get both all the time. So I do think that this might remove a level of tactical nuance from the game on these big firepower units. As I said before, I really do hope that they do something to make sure that units that feel like they should be stationary, things like artillery for example, maybe tower broadsides, aren't just getting crazy amounts of movement as well. Particularly I think that Slalom Basilisk would be a very silly thing to be seeing. Again, obviously, if these things did have less movement than most things, then I'd expect that to be reflected in the points cost. So I'd hope that the big guns would be not able to move quite as well, but also a little bit cheaper than the more mobile firepower as a result. As for the other part of the rule, the fact that you can't partially move an infantry squad anymore, I'll be honest, I find that just a little bit annoying. I think that the imagery was kind of fine there, one heavy weapon guy standing at the back, with the rest of the squad moving out to engage nearer enemy threats. Not necessarily sure that it needs a change in my opinion, but not really a big deal either way. So let me know what you think on this now. It's looking like 9th edition is really going to be a very different game to 8th edition. There's so many different changes happening to different areas of the game that it's going to be hard to work out exactly what all the pieces are going to come together to make and whether or not it's going to be better or worse. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll be covering all the 9th edition news as it comes out from Games Workshop, as well as all of our regular 40k Tactics content. If you have been enjoying all the videos recently, then I'd just like to mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which is what allows me to spend quite so much time making YouTube. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to spend less time working on regular shifts at my job and more time making YouTube videos. So if you are watching regularly, then any support, even if it's a small amount per month, is greatly appreciated. And a big thank you to all of you guys who are supporting on Patreon. You really are making this channel possible. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.